Hello, it's Jacob Campbell here for our first and hopefully last video lecture of the semester. Now, I tell you, I hate giving video lectures. I feel very uncomfortable doing them. Mostly what it comes down to is the lack of a physical audience. It's hard for me to get out of my head and get to speaking normally when I don't have a real human being in the room with me. But there's one thing that I hate more than giving a video lecture, and that's you not getting a lecture at all. If I can at all help it, you will never miss a single one of our like 44 to 45 hours of instruction in this class. So that's something to look forward to. Now, today we're going to be talking about what economics is, right? It's the first real lecture of the semester. Syllabus is out of the way. What is economics exactly? And what's some other basic foundational stuff you need to know before we can start to do economics? Now, when you hear that word economics, there are probably a ton of mental associations that you make with it. But if I were to ask you in person, what is economics? I suspect that most of you would struggle to come up with a coherent definition. So I want you to think about it right now. Pause the video if you need to. What are the things that come to your mind when you hear economics? Well, I bet that most of you would give answers like this: unemployment, recessions, inflation, business, regulation of business, taxes and budget deficits, maybe international trade with things like tariffs. When you think of economics, you probably think in a very commercial direction. It's all stuff about business, about how people make a living, businesses competing with each other, your behavior as a consumer. Perhaps most importantly of all, for our purposes as citizens, the role of the government in regulating and intervening in the running of businesses. Now, I don't like to dig into the dictionaries. A lot of classes they do that, right? They would crack open Merriam-Webster and start reading off a dictionary definition for you. And I like to avoid the dictionary because its definition is bad. It is simultaneously too wordy and also too constrained in its vision of what economics is. But to me, economics has two very simple definitions. In its broader and more accurate sense, you can say that economics is a science of choice. But in its narrower and more useful sense, you can say that economics is a science of commerce. So, as a science of commerce, economics is concerned with the economy and how people interact within it. So, what is commerce? Now, I give commerce a very precise definition in here. I try to avoid saying trade unless I'm talking about international trade. There's nothing wrong with referring to people trading with each other as trade, but I just try to be consistent throughout the class to avoid confusion. But when I say commerce, I'm talking about consensual exchange. It's people dealing with each other, people making deals, people buying and selling and haggling and trading back and forth, but doing so freely, doing so because they come to a voluntary agreement about it. And what is the economy? Well, much like economics itself, it's kind of hard to define, and yet you probably have a very clear image of what's involved in that. There's this quote from a Supreme Court justice. Don't remember which one, but I always like to bust this out. It's like pornography. I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. With the economy, you could say that it's the interlocking systems and the web of interactions people make within those systems that produce, distribute, and consume goods and resources. The economy is essentially the material aspect of society. So if society is all of us collectively and all of our relationships with each other, The economy is that segment of society that deals with making a living. We all have material needs, whether they're physical goods or intangible services, but we all have needs and we all work together to help to fulfill each other's needs. But how do we do that? And the economy is the systems that enable that. And I have a metaphor I love to use. You often hear people compare society to a living creature. In fact, I have an argument. I busted out near the very end of the course. Economy is literally a living creature, might even be conscious. But if society is like a living creature, economics would be like anatomy or medicine. How does society work to keep itself running? How do the organs of it take in resources, break them down, move them around? How does this creature live? Now, when economics began back in the 1770s, so this is a pretty young field in the grand scheme of things. It's actually, I would argue, the oldest of the social sciences. But of course, that makes it very young compared to the hard sciences, to the natural sciences. But when economics began back in the 1770s, nearly 250 years ago, it was focused on commerce specifically. And that word economic meant something kind of like thrifty. So your ancient Greeks, you know how they've got their philosophy. They love coming up with a special name for every different thing under the sun. They've got this word oikonomia, and it translates to like art of household management or to stewardship. So, a steward is a guy that you hire to run something on your behalf, to run your estate. So somebody who was skilled in this, somebody who was trained in the management of a business or of an estate or of a household, you would say that he studied the art of oikonomia. And then, separate from that, there was a thing called politike, the art of managing a country, like political. And the root word here is polis, a political state, in ancient Greece, usually a city state like Athens or Sparta. So you have oikonomia, which is the art of managing the household, the art of managing your own private resources, and then you have politike, which is the art of managing the state, the art of managing the public's resources. And by the 1700s, the two terms had kind of merged, right? You know how languages shift over time. And by then, economists were calling it political economy. So oikonomia directed towards political, directed towards politike ends. Now, this gets more confusing because political economy eventually ends up getting simplified down to economics, whereas oikonomia ends up turning into what we call home economics. Now, I bet you probably don't have home economics in your high schools anymore. They didn't have it when I was in high school. It was like a thing my parents had to do. But maybe you have a mental image of what you do in home economics. You would like learn how to sew up tears on clothes. You might learn a little bit of like basic carpentry, how to cook, how to take care of babies. All the stuff that you would need as basic life skills just to function as a normal human being. So home economics actually calls back to the original meaning of oikonomia as the art of running your household. But political economy in time came to be referred to as just economics. In the same way that home economics referred to the home, the management of the home, political economics was the management of society, political issues. And as we came to call political economy economics, that original phrase, political economy, came to have a more specific meaning of being political science and economics kind of synthesized with each other. And this is one of my main fields, but we'll talk about that a little more later in the lecture. And one of the most interesting things about early economics is that it actually grew out of political philosophy and moral philosophy, not out of business strategy. Usually, when you think of economics, you tend to think first and foremost of business. You might think that this would be stuff that would have been developed by like merchants and maybe taught in the merchant guilds. But economics was actually intended to have more of a moral foundation to it. Now, this is something that you'll hear a lot more about in Unit 2 when we get to the founding father of economics and the first economist that appears in your The Worldly Philosophers book, Adam Smith. But very often the public has this bias against economics and the economic way of thinking because they think that economics is in some way amoral and that it is because it is meant to be pragmatic, that also means that it's devoid of any moral values or of any moral function. And the reality is that it is as far away from the truth as you can get. The whole birth of economics was deeply tied up in moral philosophy, in what we would nowadays call ethics. And throughout this class, we'll be coming back to that at times to look at how different moral philosophers addressed economic issues. So you're going to get a lot, you're mostly going to get economics in this class. You're going to get a fair bit of history near the end. You're also going to get a little bit of ethics sprinkled throughout the course as well, because it's heavily tied to the origins of this field. Now, as economics expanded over 2.5 centuries, it became less focused on commerce strictly. Because the thing is, everything has a little economics in it, because everything in life involves resource management, even if the resource is just time or just choosing between options. You could say that even something as simple as your decision of what to cook for dinner is an economic decision at heart. And so economics began spinning off in whole new directions, and that's how economics grew into being what I call a science of choice. So, what do I mean by a science of choice? Economics deals with this central question of how people go about making decisions. And there are other fields that deal with this, but they deal with it in different ways, and they have different methodologies. If you've never heard that word before, and you're going to hear it a lot in this class, a methodology is like an approach to a certain science because there are different approaches in different fields. So, in decision sciences, for example, that teaches you how to improve your decision making process. That's a very applied field that's meant to make better business professionals, essentially. And then in psychology, they often try to explain human behavior in a very mechanistic and materialistic way. So it's like you're a meat puppet, you've got a brain, there's different parts of the brain that control different things, there's different chemicals, there's electrical signals firing off. But psychology looks at people as essentially being animals, even to the extent that it talks about them having volition. It's still it still assumes you're an animal at the end of the day. And so it's concerned with exploring how you come up with the ideas that you do, what's going on in that noggin of yours. But what makes economics different is its origins in that art of management, its origins in that oikonomia. Because economics assumes that people behave rationally and self interestedly. I'm sorry, that's quite a mouthful. Uh, when I say self-interestedly, that's kind of a politer way of saying selfish. Economics doesn't assume people are selfish in the sense that it assumes that they're pricks, but it assumes that they do tend to put their own interests first. all else being equal. And it tends to assume that people prefer what they prefer over what other people prefer. So, for an economist, rationality means that we assume that people behave purposefully in accordance with their goals. And to have an economic problem, you only need two things, but you do need them. You need an objective or a goal, and you need a constraint or limits on how to achieve that goal. So, some examples of objectives would be things like maximizing your profit as a business, living the happiest life you can as an individual. Or when you talk about non selfish, altruistic goals, well, charities and NGOs have goals too. For a place like Shriners Hospital, they have an economic objective in that their goal is to maximize saving children's lives. Or when you talk about some kind of religious institution, like, say, the American Bible Society, their objective is to maximize new converts. But whether people are working for themselves or whether they're working for some altruistic purpose, we assume that people have goals. People have things that they are trying to achieve as they interact with the world around them. And the problem? Well, we live in a world of scarcity. There are only so many different ways that you can tackle a problem, and there are only so many different so many resources you can use to tackle that problem. And so constraints could be things like a budget, whether as a business or as an individual or as Shriners Hospital, you face a budget. A constraint could be hours in the day. You try to live the best life you can in accordance with whatever your values are, but you have a limited amount of time on the earth. And constraints can be things like raw resources, or even different recipes or production techniques to use. I have a goal, and I have to choose between my different options. Likewise, economists usually assume that people behave self-interestedly. We assume usually that they prioritize their desires and their needs over those of others. And we especially assume this the more anonymous interactions are. And the fact of the matter is, now you'll always have certain weenies who will disagree with this, but you know deep down, deep in your dark, greedy little heart, that this is true. People will get in a tizzy about something like slave labor in China or slave labor in South Africa, putting up suicide nets to catch factory workers that are trying to jump to their deaths, making the child slaves dig the diamonds out of the hills. People will protest that, and then they will still go to the store and they'll still buy the cheap Chinese bullshit, and they'll still go to the store and they'll still buy the diamond ring. People tend to be very selfish when there is some social distance between themselves and the consequences of their actions. The more distant it is, the more selfishly they behave. And even in interactions between themselves and people that they know, they still usually put more weight on their own good, at least outside of the sphere of the family. But this is another thing that defines economics, especially in contrast to things like political science. So we don't always need this assumption. You can make economic models of things like charities, but economics tends to take a very cynical view of human nature. It's not that people are always out for themselves, but we assume that they put more weight on their needs than they do on strangers' needs. So, Does this mean that economists that does this mean that economics teaches that people make perfect decisions because they're rational? Does this mean that economics teaches that people only care about money? Does economics teach that people are emotionless? And does economics teach that people only care about themselves? No. Every one of these common misconceptions is completely wrong. So, for example, people can have bad information, and there is an entire field called information economics dedicated to the issues that arise from people having bad information or from some people having more information than others. In fact, entire things like marketing only work due to information asymmetries. People can also have tons of non-pecuniary, that is, non-monetary values. And value is in the eye of the beholder. So this is another thing that the general public often gets wrong about economics. We don't teach that the value of a thing is bound up entirely in its price. The value in modern economic theory is actually subjective. Everybody has potentially a different value for each good and service than everyone else does. And you can economically model altruism as well. All that economics does is it just maintains that people behave purposefully. They do the best they can with what they have, and that includes information, for the goal that they have set for themselves. And we don't tend to try to make assumptions about why people want what they do. If you want to do that, you've got to go back to psychology. Economics usually isn't going to be concerned about why does the consumer want this stupid Chinese bullshit. What we're interested in is how their desire changes their behavior. And this is going to imply consistency in decision making. If people are behaving rationally, then people's goals and their means should not contradict each other. Their behavior should be consistent with the fulfillment of their goal. So economists believe that people's behavior is predictable, but it's often surprising. When we run into one big difference between the way economists see the world and the way that the general public often does is that when the general public sees some strange behavior, they tend to say, oh, what a moron. They're clearly wrong. When economists see a strange behavior, what we try to do is we try to stop and ask, what does that person know that I don't? Do we believe people respond to incentives? They're trying to achieve their goals with the means they have available. And so if you change the means, you change the behavior with it. But the world is very complex. And so incentives can be used to control human behavior for good ends, but it can often have unintended consequences that cause evil. Sometimes some of the most heartbreaking evil acts you can think of. And your first assignment that I've already released has this theme. Just a selection of a few interesting things from the news and from history where bad incentives lead to bad outcomes. But you'll see this crop up all throughout the course. And it ties in heavily with the moral aspect of this. Now, is rationality always correct? Is that always the right methodology to use? The answer is no, but it's a lot more reliable than you might think. Now, there is a field called behavioral economics that was created to merge psychology with economics. And it studies the cases where people's decisions are at odds with reality or where they're inconsistent. So economics doesn't argue that people are always rational. It's just that for the sake of our science, we assume they're going to behave rationally. We know that economic models are not perfect, but it's just one toolkit in the arsenal of the social scientist. So you have the methodologies of sociology, you have the methodologies of anthropology, the methodologies of political science, the methodology of psychology. Many of these fields have different competing methodologies within them. In fact, that's something we're going to see within economics later in the course. But this is just one toolkit. And sometimes you need a different toolkit for a different job. But one thing you'll find is that economics is a very flexible toolkit. And you can use it to study other social sciences subject matter. Now, nowadays, economics studies a score of different subjects. I have seen economists study, and this is just a list of some of my favorite ones, but I've seen economists study religious phenomena. Why do hardcore churches grow faster than soft ones? Why is it like the fire and brimstone Pentecostals and Mormons and stuff that are growing faster than the really loosey-goosey Episcopalians and Lutherans? I've seen economists study family planning. How do people choose who to marry? How do people choose how many kids to have? Are dating websites efficient at pairing off couples? And that was an especially fun paper because of how they defined efficiency. The way that Hitch, Hortashiu, and Ariely did it was they defined efficiency as being that you can't find someone to cheat on you with. So it's like it's not efficient because you got your dream girl, because your dream girl is probably a bunch of other dudes' dream girl too. It's efficient though if your dream girl won't run off with you. You got the best deal that you could have gotten. Um, I actually have a mild interest in revisiting that because they found that dating websites were efficient in their day, but I've heard that they are not efficient anymore. Economists study political life. Why do revolutions seem so impossible before they happen, flare up out of nowhere, and then seem like they were always inevitable? This is a common pattern. People think that things can't change, that people will never risk their lives having an open fight. And then suddenly overnight, it's like the whole world comes crashing down on them. But there's economic theory that makes sense of that. Economists have applied economic theory to questions of military science. Back when America went into the Middle East um, through the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, the American military used this strategy. They called it nation building. Way back in Vietnam, they called it hearts and minds. But the idea is that you build things for the locals and you try to essentially act nice to the locals. It's sort of a carrot and stick type approach, but with a lot more carrot and a lot less stick. And the general public ended up rejecting this when it failed to bring the insurgencies to a close. But an economist named Berman, he went back and he found that traditional military counterinsurgency theory was actually completely correct about how to defeat an insurgency. The hearts and minds stuff works. You just have to do it correctly. Guess what? The United States didn't. It was very good at killing enemy combatants. It'd kill like 100 Afghanis for every one American lost. But it was an abysmal strategy when it came to breaking the will of the Afghani people because they implemented it in a very half-assed manner. I personally have done research into social controversies back when they were tearing down all the Confederate statues, claiming that they were all put up to support white supremacism. I did a little study on that, tried to find out, were these things put up, for that purpose? And the answer, in as much as I got one, is some of them were, but many of them were not. And I've also seen, in a similar vein, I've seen economics research into public health. So, for example, with the infamous Tuskegee syphilis experiment, something that you're going to read a little bit about later in the semester, um, that ended up causing a lot of black folks to have a huge distrust of medical professionals. And so, there are economists who've studied that and they've measured the impact of it, and it turned out, yeah, there was a big impact when when black folks didn't want to, get COVID vaccines some years ago. They had a good reason to. Go figure. When you not falling for that shit again. So these are all, things, interesting things that have nothing to do with business that I've seen economists write about. And if you want to check out the academic papers folder under files, you can find several of these. I can't guarantee that you'll be able to understand them because we'll talk about this in a moment. Graduate economics looks very different from undergraduate, but some of these are in that folder, and then these two, they're in the extra credit. If you would like to read Private Truth and Public Lies by Timur Kuran and Radical Religious and Violent by Berman. Those are two very good books, and they're very accessible. You don't have to have any economics background in order to understand them. Now, because economics involves constraints, another important concept in it is scarcity. And to an economist, scarce does not mean rare. It just means that there are limitations. You cannot have more of something without giving up something else. Because we have unlimited wants, even if you think you don't, you do. If you had $1 million growing up, you would want $2 million. People are not any more satisfied today than they were back in the Stone Age. We have unlimited wants, but we have limited resources, limited time, and limited options to fulfill them. So take a moment and think of an answer to this question. Which of the following are scarce resources? Potatoes, vacation time, and diamonds. Now, give yourself a round of applause if your answer was all of them, because all of them are scarce. Now, some of them are a hell of a lot more rare than others. Potatoes, pretty common, not too hard to get. You can go work an hour and you'll earn a wage that'll buy you several sacks of potatoes. If you don't have a store to go buy potatoes from, then if you can get your hands on a potato, you can start a potato patch and you can harvest it pretty quickly. One of the fastest breeding crops out there, grows in pretty much all terrain. Cheap, something that you can throw away carelessly. Diamonds, pretty rare, at least compared to something like potatoes. They only appear in certain parts of the earth. You have to, work to go get them. They're controlled by companies that have incentives to manipulate the supply. They're much, much more expensive. And vacation time? Well, that's pretty rare too. Usually you don't have direct control over how much vacation time you have, and most people aren't going to have a very generous amount of it. So all of these things have varying degrees of rareness, but all of them are scarce because to get more of any one, you'd have to give up some of the others. If you want more potatoes, that costs either more money or more time spent farming it yourself. How do you get more money? You work more. If you want more diamonds, the same thing is true. If you want more vacation time, you work less, but then you have less money for potatoes and diamonds. At the end of the day, there's only one resource, really, from which all other resources are made, and that is time. Also, technically, land, but you get what I mean. Time is the ultimate scarce resource. So, whether things are common or rare, they are scarce. And because of scarcity, economics is a matter of trade offs. What will be made? How will it be made? Who will it go to? And most importantly of all, who decides? Who gets to answer all of these questions? And this makes economic systems very important. So, economics was created in response to the rise of the first capitalist societies. It was developed in those capitalist societies over 250 years. And we in most of the world still live in capitalist societies today. And what do I mean by capitalism? Because capitalism, much like economics, is a very vague thing that has somewhat different meanings to different people. But capitalism, you might say, is a social system where people's economic decisions are voluntary. Work gets done based on commerce, not on forced labor. People choose where to work. People choose what to buy. And people choose their price. Doesn't mean that other people have to accept it. You can insist on any wage you want. You can insist as a salesman on any price you want. Doesn't mean that people are going to give you a job or buy your stuff. But it's up to individuals to do their own economic planning for themselves because they have the legal freedom to wheel and deal with each other. And as such, you can think of this class as being like a study of capitalism. But in order to understand a thing, it's also important to understand its antithesis, its opposite. And so, even though this is primarily a class about capitalism, this course will also often discuss socialism and Marxism. So you can think of socialism as collectively being economic systems and ideologies based around collective planning instead of markets. Systems where you give control to some kind of central political figure, like a dictator or an elected government, some grand poobah who decides where you'll work and what you'll buy and what the prices will be. And Marxism is a non-mainstream social science that studies economics from the socialist perspective. So Marxism grows out of economics, but it ends up growing off in its own weird direction where it kind of gets banished from economics. It's like anti-economics. If this was a comic book and economics was the hero, then Marxism is the cheesy, villain. I'm trying to think of one. I can't. Never mind. You know how it goes though. In the comic books, you'll have like Batman, and then you'll have fucking Dark Batman or something stupid like that. And near the end of the course, if we don't run out of time, which is entirely possible, we'll also talk a little bit about chattel slavery, which I like to describe as being capitalism with the heart torn out. Capitalistic in that you have free markets for goods and people themselves become products. But at the same time, you might have commerce over the buying and selling of people, but the labor itself is forced. In a way, it's almost like this unholy fusion of a socialist and of a capitalist system. Now, the course is going to be divided into two mega units, microeconomics and macroeconomics. And there isn't a perfect split between the two. Their subject matter overlaps a lot. So, micro or small economics is our close up look. Microeconomics would ask questions like, how would a hurricane affect orange prices? What would happen to output if a company had a monopoly? And how can two competing stores survive and make a profit? It's very intimate. It's very focused on individuals, individual workers, individual consumers, individual businesses. It usually only looks at one or two markets at a time. What's going on with oranges? What's going on with diamonds? What's going on with retail? Then macroeconomics, on the other hand, or the big picture view, it asks questions about society as a whole. What would happen to GDP if the Federal Reserve decides to inflate the currency? Why are some countries rich and other countries are poor? And how does economic structure determine the political structure of a nation? You might think of it as like, what would be the effect of adopting a capitalist or a socialist regime on the state of democracy? Macro is epic in scope. It looks at all of the sectors of society together. Usually it doesn't do this in detail. Often the way it does this is by abstracting everything to just an absolutely crazy degree. But macro is about the world at large. And throughout the class, I also teach you a lot of economic history and the history of economic thought. So the difference between the two is that economic history is a fusion of history and economics, where you're either using lessons from history to reveal truths about economics, or you're using economic theory to understand history. It's just that you're combining both fields into one field, and that gives you a better understanding of both of them at once. And this is another one of my fields, along with political economy and development economics. Now, most of the time where this comes up in class is just in examples. I feel it's a little silly that I even have to bring this up, but prior experiences taught me that I do. Um, it doesn't matter if one of my examples is from right now, from 50 years ago, or from 5,000 years ago. The world does not change. So oftentimes I have examples of economic concepts. Do we have evidence of this playing out in real life? Yes, we do. Here's a story about it. And I like to mine history for that because I can get some really wacky stuff that way. And our last unit of the semester is going to revolve around economic history because more than anything, the point of that unit is to try to explain why are some countries rich and some countries poor? Why are some countries stable and other countries are hellholes? Why are some places democracies and other places are dictatorships? Well, we can use economic theory to explain the history of those countries, how they got to the point they're in today. And in doing so, that teaches us a lot about how society works, that we can make predictions about the future and understand how a society should be run to steer it in a healthier direction. But if you like history, I always have a fair number of students that do. You're going to like that aspect of the class. Then there's the history of economic thought, and that's the history of economics, not history of the economy, but the history of economics as a field. And so usually if I come to some major economist, I take some time to tell you about the context in which they lived, how the times in which they lived shaped their beliefs. And the reason I do this is because I believe it gives you a much better understanding of the material. if you understand the world that someone was living in, then you can better appreciate why they believed what they did, and you can get into their head and understand their ideas better than perhaps even they themselves did. And I also make a big deal out of the personalities of these guys for the same reason. This is why I have you read the Worldly Philosophers, because it's wonderful for that stuff, but I also do a fair bit of it in class too. So a lot of our major economists you can think of as being like characters in a play. And when I come to a major economist, I always stop and I always try to paint a picture for you of this person as a person, because in doing so, I think it helps to make the theory more understandable, and it also helps to get you invested in their ideas. It helps to add some of that human touch that, especially for, maybe some of the more emotional among you, can make this stuff more interesting. And so this is where I give you the basic outline of the class. So for microeconomics, we're going to have about 8 weeks of material divided between 2 units. In Unit 1, Supply and Demand, we'll spend about 2 weeks covering the basic model of economics. How do market economies work? If nobody's in charge of a capitalist world, if everybody's left to their own devices to figure things out for themselves, how the heck doesn't the system fall apart? How doesn't it break down? And you'll get the answer to that. But then in Unit 2, we start to see all of the ways that things can break down in a market economy. So market economies, they're pretty good at running themselves, but there are ways that they can be flawed. You could have a government that goes in and meddles with things, or the market itself could have problems that require the government to go in and meddle with it. And one thing that you find is that usually this comes about from us relaxing some assumptions. But one by one, we'll go through these. I've got 3 big pairs of them where, we relax one set of assumptions and we see all of the ways that the market can break down. And then, and as part of this, we're going to have a big focus on environmental economics, the use of economics to guide environmental policy. And this is another one of the parts of the semester that a lot of students tend to enjoy, especially because I know many of you are forestry majors. And so you in particular should be interested in, this course's treatment of that. Then when we switch over to macro, that's about 7 weeks. 3 weeks for business cycles, 2 for heterodox schools of thought, and 2 for political economy and development. So in business cycles, we're hitting macroeconomics from the short-term perspective. And it's framed around capitalism's greatest crisis, the Great Depression, and the founding father of macroeconomics, Lord John Maynard Keynes, who, for better or worse, developed our theory of how to fight recessions and who developed our understanding of the relationship between unemployment and inflation. So, Unit 2 is a very practical guide on how a country ought to be run. How, based on mainstream economic theory, would get it in any class in any university, how an economy should be managed at the micro level. Unit 3 is going to give you that at a macro level. Then Unit 5 hits macro from the long-term perspective. So in Unit 3, we're looking at the economy as a whole, but we're talking like month to month, year to year. Why is unemployment up? Why is unemployment down? What can we do about this? Unit 5 is about the long term. What makes a country rich? What makes a country poor? What makes a country a good place to live? How does this evolve over time? And what you're going to get in that is a theory of political economy and development economics, my area of expertise, that links together capitalism, industrialization, and technological change, and democracy to show how all three of these are necessary to each other. That all three of these go hand in hand, and it was when they all kind of synced up at once in the 1770s that things finally began to change. That you go from a world where progress is very slow and very incremental to, within the space of about 200 years, the modern world as we know it now. In about 200 years from a world that would have been recognizable to the ancient Egyptians, would have had more in common with the ancient Egyptians than with us, to the world we know today. And in between the two, so there's a reason I skipped over Unit 4. In between the two, I give you heterodox schools of thought. So this course teaches mainstream economics in the other 4 units, but for that unit, I do something a little unique. Most professors don't address this, but I talk about the non-mainstream theories. And I pick 2 in particular, the super capitalist, super libertarian Austrian school and the super socialist Marxist school. Because the Austrian school had its own theory of the business cycle, a very plausible one that competes with the Keynesian theory from Unit 3. And Marxism had both a theory of the business cycle and of political economy and development. So I use these 2 topics as a way to transition from the short-term perspective to the long-term perspective, while also talking about economic methodology, talking about the way that these non-mainstream or heterodox schools of thought about economics as a science, how they critiqued economics as a science, and what they thought that economics should aspire to be. But there are a few things I want to point out. Unit 1 is going to be brutally boring for you. It's pretty boring for me. I don't start to enjoy it until the elasticity lecture, and you all, you all don't tend to start to enjoy it until Unit 2. But it's not fun, but we have to do it because the model that I lay out in Unit 1 is the basis for all of the models in Unit 2 and Unit 3. You're not going to be able to understand Unit 2 and Unit 3 unless you get it down pat in the first 2 weeks of class. So you need to take it seriously. And another thing that you'll find about these units is it gets easier and it gets more fun as we go throughout the course. So Unit 2 is very dense. It's very dense on information. It's somewhat hard. But if you get through it, if you bear with it and you come through it okay, you'll be fine on Unit 3, Unit 4, and Unit 5. It's the most technical part of the class. And so if you don't let that put you off, if you're willing to put in the work and keep passing your quizzes, you'll be fine once you get to macro. And for most of you, it's only going to get better as things go on. So if you really like environmental issues, you'll probably like Unit 2 the most. If you really like history, you're going to like Unit 5 the most. And if you don't like either, you'll like Unit 3 the most. But the big thing is to be patient, because in other classes, it tends to get more difficult as you get in because you get into more advanced material. But economics just isn't that way. Macro is easier. It's easier even at a graduate level. It just happens that you have to know micro to be able to talk about macro. Now, another point that we need to talk about is the role of models in economics. So, all sciences are built around models. It's just that most sciences, at like the survey course level, don't really talk about them. They don't admit it. They don't put it front and center. Well, what is a model? A model is a stylized simplification of reality. So we make assumptions about the world, or we make assumptions about human nature or behavior, and then we derive predictions from those assumptions. And the models are always inaccurate. So this is something that the general public often criticizes economics about, but we know that our models are inaccurate. We don't claim otherwise, and we're okay with that. And the reason we're okay with that is that they don't have to be 100% accurate in order to be useful. See, the problem is we live in a very complex world. And if you were to try to take into consideration all of the possible effects of something, you would never be able to solve your way down to an answer. If you were to say something like, what would be the effect of a hurricane on orange prices? Well, the quick common sense answer would be orange prices will probably go up because it's a natural disaster and maybe it destroys some of the crop. Yeah, they probably go up. But then you might say, well, what if the hurricane also wipes out bananas, which are a substitute to oranges? What if the hurricane causes people to take their lives more seriously, like they survive it, and so they decide to start eating more healthy, and so they want more oranges? You can go off on these crazy tangents and these crazy rabbit holes if you try to take every little detail of real life into consideration. And so the only way that you can even begin to tackle a question like that is to start simplifying. So we need to cut out all of the unnecessary detail. Yes, there are weird edge cases that could happen. Yes, there are a million little small effects where it's like the butterfly effect. One thing happens that sets this domino effect of other reactions. But in order to be able to get an actual practical, actionable answer, we're going to have to clear our minds of all of that and only use what's necessary. Now, I like to think of this as being like a caricature. One of those exaggerated pictures of a person that makes them look like some almost like some monster, but it takes their facial features, bends them all out of proportion. And the caricature doesn't look anything like the real person does, but in some ways it looks more like them than a photograph would. So take this guy on the right as an example. I'll give you a few seconds. Do you know who that is? Did you guess Richard Nixon? That's old Tricky Dick. And I bet if we were in person and I asked you that question, a number of you would have raced the moment I asked it to say, it's Richard Nixon. But the two don't really look anything alike at all, do they? Here you've got a fairly normal looking guy on the left, healthy person. And here on the right, you have this monster. He's got a nose that's bigger than more people's feet. He has a jaw that's sinking down to his breast. He's got these giant ears. This thing, if you saw the dude on the right on the street, you'd probably run away screaming. And yet, with no guidance, I guarantee in person, several of you would have correctly guessed Richard Nixon. Because that's the magic of a caricature. A caricature is inaccurate. It's intentionally inaccurate, but it's inaccurate in that it takes the most notable aspects of a person, the things that make them distinctive, and then it exaggerates it to draw attention to it. And in doing so, it kind of captures the essence of that person. Well, in the sciences, this is what we do with models. The models don't have all of the real detail. The models often exaggerate things, like, for example, assuming that people are usually selfish. But there's enough truth in them on the most important details that you can make a good sketch of reality. It doesn't have every little dimple, it doesn't have every little wrinkle like reality would. It doesn't have all the little fine features of the face, yet it's still recognizable. And it's something that you can do some work with. And you'll find the natural sciences are no better on this regard. Even physics, the hardest science, the science that seems to get the most respect from the public, is really just a model. We don't know 100% about how the physical world works. And for those of you, I mean, there was a big meme a while back about spherical frictionless cows in the textbooks. Well, you're going to be working with a lot of spherical frictionless cows in this class. But this isn't, I wouldn't even say this is a necessary evil. This is just how we work. So when I make claims in this class, or when I say assume this, I know that's not the real world and all of its complexity, but it doesn't have to be. It just has to do the job well enough. We have a saying, all models are wrong, some of them are useful. Now, at a graduate level, the models are a field of theoretical mathematics. So it's math done the ancient Greek way. You've got a precise mathematical definition. It'll be written up in set theory. And then you you take a couple axioms, you start proving theorems off of it. So for those of you who don't know what that means, again, I've got a graduate textbook posted on the Canvas academic papers folder. Math done with symbols. Now, majors, on the other hand, they mostly use graphical arguments and algebra, a little bit of light calculus. As non-majors, I will be showing you graphs, but I'm never going to test you on graphs. So traditional economics pedagogy relies heavily on kind of these geometric arguments where we'll chart something out on a graph, and then we'll show how the moving around curves on the graph changes the distribution of resources. I use that same approach, but I'm not going to require you to do geometry. I'm not going to require you to do algebra. Instead, what I prefer to do is I prioritize storytelling. I prefer giving real world examples. I would usually rather give you a memorable story than a statistic that you're going to forget within 5 minutes. And this is the approach of the great economist Thomas Sowell. So Thomas Sowell is like a patron saint around here because Clemson University is a heavily Chicago school influenced department. A lot of the people that go here, myself included, go here because it mostly has faculty who got their PhDs at the University of Chicago. And Thomas Sowell was one of the greatest Chicago school economists of all time. And he wrote this excellent book, Basic Economics, that this was what I read in high school that got me into the subject. And if you were to walk away from this class and just try to teach yourself economics on your own, that's what I would recommend starting with. But Thomas Sowell has this same approach. When he teaches people, he does not prioritize statistics. He doesn't do a bunch of crazy, complicated stuff with geometry. Um, he gives you the theory in plain English, and then he gives you some examples of that theory happening in real life. And so, because you all are non-majors and your proficiency level of math is going to be all over the place, and you're not probably not going to be working with this stuff in the future, I try to keep it more conversational in here. I try to keep it very accessible for people of all kinds of different backgrounds. And I would usually rather also keep it fun when I can. And finally, throughout this class, there are going to be some big ideas we will be building towards. Mine are different from the textbook, but I've laid out 9 here, and I'm going to give them to you as a quick preview. Number 1, people respond to incentives. We assume people are rational, people have goals, and they try to act upon those goals in a way that achieves the goal as efficiently as possible. If you change the rules of the game, if you change the means available to people, you're going to change their behavior with it. So people respond to incentives, and this can be used for good, but very often it's perverse incentives. Very often the incentives lead to people behaving in ways that we do not want. Almost always predictable in hindsight, but very often surprising. Number 2, trade-offs are everywhere. Trade-offs often appear in places that you don't expect to see them. But trade-offs are everywhere. Nothing in life is free. Oftentimes, if you have some favorite policy that you want to be implemented, there may be good arguments to have that policy, but it's going to come at some cost. Nothing in life is free, and that includes the laws that we make. Number 3, voluntary trade or commerce creates value. It creates value in and of itself. Not only does it act to efficiently allocate resources, but commerce is a source of creation even by itself. That just by redistributing resources voluntarily, you can create a wealthier society than you had before, even if the physical resources available are the same. Number 4, the richest societies match self-interest with the common interest. The richest societies in the world accept that people are primarily self-interested. Rather than asking people to try to overcome their warped human nature, they work with their human nature by redirecting it towards socially productive goals. Number 5, markets usually maximize efficiency. Keyword usually. So throughout Unit 2, you will see a score of ways that government intervention can screw up a market. But there are exceptions. There are times when the market itself isn't going to do the job, and then you need the government to step in. That said, we consider those exceptions. That's not the default. Number 6, cooperation creates more wealth than predation. There's kind of a common myth in our society that economic growth comes at regular people's expense. This is bullshit. It is a complete lie. And it not only that, but it's a lie that you can easily disprove by just looking at a map of GDP around the world. But this is what you're going to see in Unit 5. There are a lot of parasites in this world. There are a lot of people who make their living off of someone else's expense. But when you have a society that is geared towards parasitism, a society that encourages parasitic behavior, that has bad effects on that society. And societies that do that for a long time tend to wind up drained, sick, weak, and ultimately dead. Number 7, incentives drive innovation, which drives growth. Most most improvements in living standards in the grand scheme of things depend on technological change. But technological change, a practical applied technological change, depends on entrepreneurship. Number 8, capitalism and democracy need each other to survive. There's a reason why the original democracies were capitalist. There's a reason why communist regimes always wound up being very deadly, very nasty dictatorships. Your economic system and your political system can't be separated because they both shape the other in their image, and one of them is going to win out. Wherever you have a centralization of economic planning, you're generally going to get a very centralized political system to go with it. Likewise, where economic planning is decentralized, you have a better environment for a decentralized political system. And then finally, number 9, capitalism and democracy together create human flourishing. When you combine point numbers 8, 6, and 7 all together, you get a story where decentralized societies create the fertile ground for that technological growth, but also for better lives in general, more peaceful lives, lives without fear. But that's where I'm going to cut this video. You'll see on the PowerPoint on Canvas that there was another page or two. That was just talking a little bit more about the role of politics in this class. You can kind of think of this course as going well with a civics education, but you can look at that if you're interested. This is where I'm cutting the video.